Certainly. Here's a description of Mr. Majak Nasser and his encounter with his son Deng in his hut, based on the content of your document. Character of Mr. Majak Nasser. Background: Mr. Majak Nasser is Deng's father, a high-ranking military officer, lieutenant general, in the Sudanese army, originally from South Sudan, Dinka tribe. He is married to Mrs. Ababa Nasser, an Ethiopian Christian. Personality traits: authoritative and proud. He is strict, proud of his status, and expects obedience from his son. He is deeply invested in family honor and reputation. Traditional and conservative. He holds strong views about race, marriage, and social hierarchy, and is skeptical of his son's relationship with Insaf, an Arab girl. Emotionally complex. Despite his sternness, he is capable of deep emotion, missing his son and wife after their estrangement, and is ultimately moved by paternal concern. Judgmental and blunt. He is quick to judge Insaf harshly, calling her a criminal, murderer, thief, and dirty prostitute, and blames her for his family's troubles. Capable of regret. Although he is angry and disappointed, he is not immune to regret and longing for reconciliation. The encounter in Deng's hut. Setting: Mr. Majak Nasser visits Deng in his small, impoverished hut in the Alisha shantytown, a stark contrast to the family's former affluent home. Key moments. Initial reaction: Mr. Nasser is shocked and saddened by the squalor in which his son lives, surrounded by poverty, stray dogs, and children. He is almost unable to recognize Deng, who has become thin, unkempt, and depressed. Father's disappointment. He expresses his disappointment and anger, saying even a stray dog would not live in such a place, and blames Deng's disobedience for his misery. Blame and accusation. Mr. Nasser accuses Insaf of being the cause of all their problems, calling her a fallen Arab girl, and blames her for the breakup of the family and Deng's ruined prospects. Deng's defense. Deng, in tears, tries to explain that Insaf did not leave him willingly, but that their marriage was annulled by the Sharia court due to racial prejudice. He insists that Insaf never saw him as inferior and that their love was genuine. Father's refusal to accept. Mr. Nasser refuses to accept this, calling the Sharia court's ruling nonsense, and reiterates his belief that the relationship was doomed from the start due to racial and social differences. Offer of reconciliation. Despite his anger, Mr. Nasser offers Deng a chance to return home, but only if he leaves Insaf and their unborn child behind. He makes it clear that he will never accept Insaf as part of the family. Deng's loyalty. Deng refuses, stating that Insaf is his wife and the child is his, and that he will protect them at any cost, even if it means being disowned by his father. Departure. The encounter ends with Mr. Nasser leaving in anger and disappointment, unable to reconcile with his son as long as Insaf is in his life. Summary of the encounter's tone and meaning. The scene is emotionally charged, filled with pain, misunderstanding, and the clash between tradition and personal loyalty. Mr. Majak Nasser is portrayed as a tragic figure, powerful and proud, but ultimately isolated by his inability to accept his son's choices and the changing world around him. The encounter highlights the deep generational and cultural divides at the heart of the novel, as well as the cost of love and defiance in the face of entrenched prejudice. Here is a detailed description of Deng's response during his encounter with his father, Mr. Majak Nasser, in his initial reaction. Deng is deeply affected by his father's visit. He is living in poverty and isolation, physically and emotionally diminished by the loss of his family, his wife Insaf, and his former life. When his father arrives, Deng is subdued, respectful, and emotionally fragile. He sits on the floor, cross-legged, like a student before a stern teacher, and listens to his father's harsh words. Defending Insaf and himself. Tears and pain. Deng is moved to tears by his father's accusations and disappointment. He tries to explain that Insaf did not leave him willingly, but was forced away by the Sharia court's annulment of their marriage due to racial prejudice. Affirmation of love. Deng insists that Insaf never saw him as inferior, and that their love was genuine and mutual. He rejects his father's view that Insaf is a fallen Arab girl or a prostitute and defends her character and their relationship. Responsibility. Deng takes responsibility for his choices, acknowledging that he disobeyed his parents, but maintains that his love for Insaf was sincere and worth the sacrifices he made. Refusal to abandon Insaf. Loyalty. When his father offers him a chance to return home on the condition that he leaves Insaf and their unborn child, Deng refuses. He states unequivocally that Insaf is his wife, the child is his, and he will protect them at any cost, even if it means being disowned by his father. Courage and defiance. Deng's response is marked by a quiet but firm courage. He does not raise his voice or become aggressive, but he stands his ground, even as his father becomes more agitated and angry. Emotional complexity. Sadness and hope. Deng is heartbroken by the rift with his father, but he does not let it break his spirit or his commitment to Insaf. He expresses hope that, despite everything, his father might one day understand or forgive him. Sense of injustice. Deng is frustrated by the injustice of the Sharia court's decision and the prejudice that has destroyed his marriage and family. He tries to make his father see that their suffering is not due to personal failure, but to a system that values race and tribe over love and humanity. Summary of Deng's response. Deng's response is a mixture of pain, loyalty, and moral courage. He is respectful but unyielding, defending his wife and their love against his father's accusations and the weight of tradition. He chooses love and integrity over comfort and acceptance, even at great personal cost. Here's an analysis of Mrs. Ababa Nasser's character and her reactions to Insaf in the hospital in London. Character of Mrs. Ababa Nasser. Background. Mrs. Ababa Nasser is Deng's mother, an Ethiopian Christian married to Mr. Majak Nasser, a Sudanese army officer. She is a strong, proud, and protective mother, shaped by her own cultural and religious background. Personality traits. Protective and possessive. She is fiercely protective of her son, especially after his injury and disability. Judgmental and unforgiving. She harbors deep resentment toward Insaf, blaming her for Deng's suffering and the family's misfortunes. Emotionally volatile. Her reactions are intense. She is quick to anger, prone to outbursts, and not afraid to express her feelings, even in public. Traditional and suspicious. She is suspicious of outsiders and resistant to accepting Insaf, whom she sees as a source of trouble and pain. Her reactions to Insaf in the London hospital. Initial encounter. When Insaf, traveling under the name Emily Matthew, arrives at the hospital in London to see Deng, Mrs. Ababa Nasser is immediately suspicious and hostile. She does not recognize Insaf at first, but when she realizes who she is, she reacts with anger and fear, shouting at her to leave and calling for security. Accusations and outburst. Mrs. Ababa Nasser accuses Insaf of being the cause of all her son's suffering. She blames Insaf for Deng's injury, disability, and estrangement from the family. She calls Insaf a murderer, a criminal, and a source of shame, listing all the alleged crimes and scandals associated with her. She is not moved by Insaf's tears or explanations, and instead escalates the situation by reporting her to hospital security and the police for using a false identity. Refusal to reconcile. Even when Deng tries to defend Insaf and insists on her innocence and their love, Mrs. Ababa Nasser refuses to listen. She insists that Insaf is not welcome, that she is not Deng's wife, and that she must be removed for the safety and well-being of her son. Aftermath. Mrs. Ababa Nasser's actions result in Insaf being detained by the police, further complicating her legal and emotional struggles. The confrontation leads to a final rupture between Deng and his mother, as Deng chooses to stand by Insaf, even at the cost of losing his mother's support. Analysis of impact. On Mrs. Ababa Nasser. Her inability to forgive or accept Insaf reveals her rigid adherence to tradition, her deep-seated fears, and her struggle to cope with loss and change. Her actions are driven by a mix of grief, pride, and a desire to protect her son, but they ultimately isolate her from him. On Insaf. The encounter is deeply traumatic, reinforcing Insaf's sense of being unwanted and persecuted, even by those who should be family. It highlights the persistent barriers of prejudice, misunderstanding, and the difficulty of reconciliation across cultural and personal divides. On Deng. The confrontation forces Deng to make a painful choice between his mother and his wife, solidifying his loyalty to Insaf and marking a turning point in his own journey toward independence and self-definition. Summary. Mrs. Ababa Nasser is portrayed as a tragic, complex figure. Her love for her son is fierce, but her inability to move past blame and prejudice leads to further suffering for everyone involved. Her reactions in the London hospital scene are a culmination of her fears, grief, and cultural values, and they serve as a powerful obstacle to Insaf's quest for acceptance and peace. Mrs. Ababa Nasser's attitude toward Insaf, marked by hostility, blame, and rejection, has a profound and painful impact on both Deng and Insaf. Here's an analysis of how her stance affects each of them. Impact on Deng. 1. Emotional pain and isolation. Deng is deeply hurt by his mother's refusal to accept Insaf, especially after all the suffering he and Insaf have endured. Mrs. Ababa Nasser's accusations that Insaf is responsible for his injury, disability, and family estrangement compound Deng's sense of loss and abandonment. The confrontation in the hospital forces Deng to choose between his mother and his wife. When Mrs. Ababa Nasser demands that Insaf be removed and calls security, Deng is devastated, but stands by Insaf, even as it means losing his mother's support. 2. Strengthening of loyalty and identity. Mrs. Ababa Nasser's rejection ultimately strengthens Deng's loyalty to Insaf. He defends her against his mother's accusations, insists on her innocence, and refuses to let her be humiliated or cast out. This moment marks a turning point for Deng. He asserts his independence from his family's expectations and prejudices, choosing love and personal conviction over tradition and parental approval. 3. Family rupture. The encounter leads to a final rupture between Deng and his mother. Mrs. Ababa Nasser leaves, and Deng is left to care for his son and support Insaf alone, deepening his sense of responsibility, but also his isolation from his roots. Impact on Insaf. 1. Reinforcement of trauma and alienation. Insaf's encounter with Mrs. Ababa Nasser is deeply traumatic. She is not only rejected, but also publicly accused of being a murderer, criminal, and the cause of all the family's suffering. This rejection by a potential mother-in-law, especially after so much hardship, reinforces Insaf's sense of being unwanted and persecuted, even by those who should be family. 2. Undermining of belonging and security. The incident in the hospital shatters any hope Insaf might have had for reconciliation or acceptance into Deng's family. She is left feeling even more isolated and vulnerable, especially as she faces legal troubles and the threat of deportation. Mrs. Ababa Nasser's actions, calling security, reporting her to the police, directly lead to Insaf's detention and further legal complications, putting her at risk of being extradited to Sudan. 3. Resilience and self-reliance. Despite the pain, Insaf's experience with Mrs. Ababa Nasser ultimately contributes to her resilience. She learns that she cannot rely on acceptance from others and must find strength within herself and her immediate family, Deng, and their child. The ordeal also deepens her bond with Deng, as they both realize they must face the world together, often without the support of their families or communities. Summary table. Effect on Deng on Insaf. Emotional pain, isolation, forced independence, trauma, alienation, loss of belonging. Relational final break with mother, loyalty to wife, rejection by in-laws, deepened isolation. Identity asserts independence, chooses love, strengthens self-reliance, resilience. Practical must care for family alone, faces legal peril, must rely on herself. In summary, Mrs. Ababa Nasser's attitude is a catalyst for both Deng and Insaf's growth, but through pain and loss. It severs old family ties, but also clarifies their priorities and strengthens their commitment to each other, even as it leaves them more isolated and vulnerable in a hostile world. Certainly. Here's how Insaf is rescued by Jennifer Beals and a summary of Jennifer's encounter with the Sudanese legal representative at the Sudanese embassy in London. How Insaf is rescued by Jennifer Beals. Imminent extradition threat. Insaf, after being detained in London for traveling on a false passport, faces extradition to Sudan, where she risks execution for a murder conviction and apostasy. The British police and the United Nations office in London are informed by the Sudanese embassy that Insaf is a fugitive convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Deng's appeal. Deng, now disabled and caring for their child, desperately appeals to the United Nations office in London for help, explaining that Insaf was granted a presidential pardon in Sudan and that the charges against her are politically and religiously motivated. He provides details about Sudanese newspapers that reported the presidential pardon. Jennifer Beals' investigation. Jennifer Beals, a compassionate legal advisor at the UN office, takes Deng's appeal seriously. She searches for evidence of the pardon in Sudanese newspapers. She finds and prints articles from Al Maidan and Al Sahafa newspapers, which confirm that Insaf received a presidential pardon for the murder conviction. Jennifer's advocacy. Jennifer brings these documents to the attention of the British authorities, arguing that Insaf should not be extradited because she has already been pardoned and would face persecution for apostasy if returned to Sudan. She also confronts the Sudanese embassy's legal advisor, challenging the misleading reports they sent to the British police and the UN office in India. Outcome. Thanks to Jennifer's intervention and the documentary evidence, the United Nations office grants Insaf refugee status in the UK. The British police drop the extradition, and Insaf is released from detention, reuniting with Deng and their child. Jennifer's encounter with the Sudanese legal representative. Purpose of the visit. Jennifer visits the Sudanese embassy in London to confront the legal advisor about the misleading information sent to the British police and the UN office in India regarding Insaf's case. The confrontation. The Sudanese legal advisor is initially polite but quickly becomes defensive when Jennifer presents the Sudanese newspaper articles proving the presidential pardon. He tries to dismiss the evidence, especially the Al Maidan article, calling it a banned communist newspaper, and claims that the pardon was conditional and later revoked due to Insaf's alleged continued immoral behavior. Jennifer insists that the embassy's reports were misleading and that, in the UK, secular law and human rights take precedence over religious law. Key points of the encounter. Jennifer challenges the legal advisor's authority and the embassy's attempt to have Insaf extradited for apostasy and murder. She makes it clear that the UK will not extradite someone to face execution for apostasy or a crime for which they have already been pardoned. The legal advisor tries to justify the embassy's actions by referencing Sudanese religious law, but Jennifer stands firm on the principles of international law and human rights. Result. Jennifer's intervention is decisive in preventing Insaf's extradition and securing her refugee status. She also exposes the embassy's manipulation of information and ensures that Insaf's case is treated fairly under UK and international law. Summary. Jennifer Beals's determination, legal expertise, and compassion are crucial in saving Insaf from extradition and likely execution. Her confrontation with the Sudanese embassy highlights the clash between authoritarian, religiously motivated legal systems and the principles of justice and human rights upheld by international law. Jennifer Beals plays a crucial, heroic role in rescuing Insaf from extradition and likely execution, as detailed in your document. Here's how her actions shape Insaf's fate. Jennifer's role in Insaf's rescue. 1. Compassionate advocacy. Jennifer is a legal advisor at the United Nations office in London. She is moved by Deng's heartfelt appeal for his wife, Insaf, who is facing extradition to Sudan on charges of murder and apostasy. Unlike others who see only the legal complexities, Jennifer responds with empathy, taking Deng's story seriously and treating Insaf as a person, not just a case number. 2. Investigative determination. Jennifer listens to Deng's claim that Insaf was granted a presidential pardon in Sudan, a fact ignored by the Sudanese embassy's reports to the British authorities. She conducts her own investigation, searching for documentary evidence in Sudanese newspapers, Al Maidan and Al Sahafa, to verify the pardon. 3. Legal expertise and action. Upon finding and printing the relevant newspaper articles, Jennifer translates and compiles them as evidence. She presents this evidence to the British authorities and the United Nations, arguing that Insaf should not be extradited because she has already been pardoned and would face persecution for apostasy if returned to Sudan. 4. Confrontation with the Sudanese embassy. Jennifer confronts the Sudanese embassy's legal advisor in London, challenging the misleading and incomplete information they provided to the British police and the UN office in India. She insists on the supremacy of international law and human rights over religious or political motivations, making it clear that the UK will not extradite someone to face execution for apostasy or a crime for which they have been pardoned. 5. Securing Insaf's freedom. Thanks to Jennifer's intervention, the United Nations office grants Insaf refugee status in the UK. The British police drop the extradition proceedings, and Insaf is released from detention, reuniting with Deng and their child. Summary of Jennifer's impact. Jennifer is the catalyst for justice. She bridges the gap between Deng's desperate plea and the bureaucratic machinery of international law. She uses her legal skills, compassion, and persistence to uncover the truth, challenge injustice, and ensure that Insaf is protected from persecution. Without Jennifer's intervention, Insaf would almost certainly have been sent back to Sudan to face imprisonment or execution. In essence, Jennifer Beals is the embodiment of principled advocacy and international solidarity, transforming Insaf's story from one of despair to one of hope and rescue. Jennifer Beals discovers the crime, misconduct, of the UN Muslim legal advisor in New Delhi against Insaf through a combination of investigative diligence and critical analysis of the bureaucratic process. Here's how it unfolds. How Jennifer discovers the crime. 1. The problem emerges. Jennifer, as the UN legal advisor in London, is handling Deng's appeal to save Insaf from extradition to Sudan. She learns that the Sudanese embassy in London has been informed about Insaf's arrest and is pushing for her extradition, using information that originated from the UN office in New Delhi. 2. Suspicion of a leak. Jennifer wonders how the Sudanese embassy in London learned about Insaf's arrest and her use of a false passport, since this information should have been confidential. She suspects that the leak may have come from within the United Nations system, specifically from the UN office in New Delhi, which had previously handled Insaf's refugee application in India. 3. Investigative steps. Jennifer reviews the official correspondence and discovers that the legal advisor at the UN office in New Delhi, named Mustafa Muhammad Abdul Bari, had communicated directly with the Sudanese embassy, sharing confidential details about Insaf's case. She realizes that this action constitutes a breach of professional ethics and a conflict of interest, as the UN legal advisor is supposed to protect asylum seekers, not collaborate with their persecutors. 4. Reporting and consequences. Jennifer immediately contacts the director of the United Nations office in London and reports the violation. As a result of her report and the evidence she provides, the Muslim legal advisor in New Delhi is arrested and thrown behind bars for the crime of conflict of interest at work. Key points from the document. Jennifer's discovery is not accidental. It is the result of her careful questioning of how confidential information about Insaf's case reached the Sudanese embassy. She uses her position, access to internal communications, and her commitment to justice to expose the wrongdoing. Her actions not only save Insaf, but also help to uphold the integrity of the international refugee protection system. In summary, Jennifer's vigilance, critical thinking, and willingness to challenge both external and internal misconduct are essential to uncovering the UN legal advisor's betrayal and ensuring Insaf's protection. Muslim legal advisor in New Delhi, Mustafa Mohammed Abdulbari, who betrayed INSAF's case, are as follows. Consequences for the UN legal advisor. Discovery of misconduct. Jennifer Beals, the UN legal advisor in London, uncovers that the legal advisor in New Delhi had improperly shared confidential information about INSAF's asylum application with the Sudanese embassy. This act constitutes a serious breach of professional ethics and a conflict of interest. Reporting the crime. Jennifer immediately reports the violation to the director of the United Nations office in London, providing evidence of the misconduct. Arrest and detention. As a direct result of Jennifer's report and the evidence she provides, the Muslim legal advisor in New Delhi is arrested and thrown behind bars for the crime of conflict of interest at work. Professional and legal repercussions. The legal advisor loses his position at the United Nations office. He faces criminal charges for his actions, specifically for violating the trust and mandate of the UN by collaborating with a government that was actively persecuting an asylum seeker. Summary. The UN legal advisor's betrayal leads to his exposure, arrest, and imprisonment. His actions are treated as a serious crime within the UN system, reinforcing the importance of integrity and confidentiality in protecting vulnerable asylum seekers like INSAF. The exposure and arrest of the UN Muslim legal advisor in New Delhi for betraying INSAF's case has serious consequences for the reputation of the United Nations office, both within the story and in a broader, real-world context. Impact on the UN office's reputation. 1. Erosion of trust. Among asylum seekers, the revelation that a UN legal advisor secretly collaborated with a persecuting government, Sudan, undermines the trust that vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers place in the UN system. If the very institution meant to protect them can betray their confidentiality, it creates fear and discourages others from seeking help. Within the international community, other humanitarian organizations, governments, and advocacy groups may question the reliability and integrity of the UN's refugee protection mechanisms. 2. Institutional accountability. The incident exposes a serious breach of professional ethics and duty of care within the UN. It highlights the risk of bad actors within even the most respected institutions and the need for robust oversight, transparency, and accountability. The arrest and punishment of the legal advisor are necessary steps, but they also serve as a public admission of failure in internal controls. 3. Damage to moral authority. The UN's moral authority depends on its perceived impartiality, confidentiality, and commitment to human rights. This scandal damages that authority, especially in the eyes of those it is meant to serve. It provides ammunition to critics who claim that international organizations are bureaucratic, corrupt, or susceptible to political influence. 4. Need for reform. The incident may prompt calls for internal reform, better vetting of staff, stronger whistleblower protections, and more transparent complaint and investigation procedures. It also highlights the importance of individuals like Jennifer Beals, whose vigilance and integrity can help restore faith in the system. 5. Narrative consequence in the novel. In the context of the story, the exposure of the legal advisor's crime and Jennifer's intervention ultimately help restore some faith in the UN system, showing that justice and accountability are possible, but only when individuals act with courage and principle. Summary table. Consequence description. Erosion of trust. Refugees and partners may fear betrayal or lack of confidentiality. Institutional accountability. UN must address internal failures and demonstrate consequences for breaches. Damage to moral authority undermines the UN's standing as a protector of human rights. Need for reform prompts calls for better oversight, transparency, and staff vetting. Narrative redemption. Jennifer's actions show that integrity can still prevail within the system. In summary, the crime and exposure of the UN legal advisor in New Delhi caused significant reputational harm to the UN office, but also serve as a catalyst for accountability and reform, both in the story and as a reflection of real-world institutional challenges. Certainly. Here is a summary of the bad end of the Sudanese boy who accuses Insaf of being a drug dealer and prostitute as a student in India from the same city as Insaf, Al-Ghadarif. He publicly insults Insaf in the Bombay Criminal Court, calling her a prostitute and drug dealer, and claims, falsely, to have had sex with her in Sudanese brothels. He is the one whom Insaf, in a moment of humiliation and self-defense, strikes in the eye with her high-heeled shoe, blinding him in one eye. His fate, bad end. After the incident with Insaf, he becomes known as the One-Eyed Antichrist among the Sudanese student community. He is later arrested and imprisoned in Arthur Road Men's Jail in Bombay, awaiting trial on an attempted rape charge. The charge, when his Indian landlady came to collect rent, he tried to rape her. She screamed for help, neighbors broke down the door, and they beat him severely before the police arrived. The Indian police delayed taking him to the hospital, hoping he would die from his injuries. He was eventually taken to a filthy hospital for untouchables, but was saved by Sudanese colleagues who moved him to a better hospital. After a month in the hospital, he is transferred back to jail to stand trial for attempted rape. If convicted, which is likely, he faces a 20-year sentence in a harsh Bombay prison, where he may die or be killed by Indian gang members. After serving his sentence, he will be deported to Sudan, blacklisted from returning to India, and will return home with a criminal record and no university degree. Summary. The Sudanese boy who slandered and humiliated Insaf ends up disgraced, physically maimed, blinded in one eye, imprisoned for a serious crime, attempted rape, and facing a bleak future of long incarceration, deportation, and social ruin. His fate is presented as a form of poetic justice for his cruelty and false accusations against Insaf. The narrative significance of the bad end of the Sudanese boy who accuses Insaf of being a drug dealer and prostitute is substantial within the structure and themes of the abominable love analysis grounded in your document. 1. Poetic justice and moral retribution. The boy's fate, being blinded, disgraced, imprisoned for attempted rape, and facing a bleak future, serves as a form of poetic justice. His public slander, cruelty, and misogyny toward Insaf are ultimately turned back on him. The narrative uses his downfall to illustrate that those who perpetuate false accusations, violence, and social cruelty are not immune to suffering or punishment themselves. 2. Critique of social hypocrisy. The boy represents the hypocrisy and double standards of the Sudanese diaspora community. He loudly condemns Insaf for alleged immorality, yet is himself guilty of a far greater crime, attempted rape. His fate exposes the dangers of unchecked rumor, mob mentality, and the willingness of a community to believe the worst about a vulnerable woman while ignoring the real predatory behavior of men. 3. Empowerment of the marginalized. Insaf's act of self-defense, throwing her shoe and blinding him in one eye, is both literal and symbolic. It is a rare moment where she is able to strike back against her oppressors, even as she continues to suffer. The narrative suggests that the marginalized and slandered may find moments of agency, and that the truth about their accusers may eventually come to light. 4. Thematic reinforcement. The boy's downfall reinforces the novel's broader themes: the destructive power of prejudice, the vulnerability of women to social and sexual violence, and the ultimate necessity of justice, whether legal, poetic, or divine. It also highlights the cyclical nature of violence and retribution in societies marked by deep divisions and a lack of compassion. 5. Cautionary tale. His story serves as a cautionary tale for the community and the reader. Those who engage in slander, misogyny, and violence may themselves become victims of the very systems and attitudes they uphold. In summary, the Sudanese boy's bad end is not just a personal tragedy. It is a narrative device that exposes the hypocrisy of social judgment, delivers poetic justice, and underscores the novel's critique of gendered and communal violence. It stands as a warning against the dangers of rumor, prejudice, and the failure to see the humanity in others. The subplot involving the Sudanese boy who falsely accuses Insaf of being a drug dealer and prostitute has a significant impact on Insaf's story, both in terms of plot development and her character arc. Here's how it affects her. 1. Intensifies Insaf's social isolation and vulnerability. The boy's public slander in the Bombay criminal court and among the Sudanese student community in India leads to Insaf's further ostracism. She is shunned by her own countrymen and denied support, even when she is most vulnerable and in need of allies. This isolation leaves her almost entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers, like the Indian Christian family, reinforcing her outsider status and the theme of exile. 2. Deepens her trauma and sense of injustice. The false accusations and the willingness of the Sudanese community to believe and amplify them add to Insaf's trauma. She is not only fighting legal battles, but also the weight of communal shame, misogyny, and racism. The humiliation she experiences, being called a prostitute and criminal, and being physically attacked echoes the injustices she faced in Sudan, showing that prejudice and cruelty follow her even in exile. 3. Forces her to assert herself. Insaf's act of self-defense, throwing her shoe and blinding the boy in one eye, is a pivotal moment. It is both a desperate response to public humiliation and a symbolic act of resistance against her oppressors. This moment marks a shift in her character from passive victim to someone who, even when cornered, will fight back for her dignity. 4. Highlights the hypocrisy of her accusers. The boy's eventual downfall, being arrested for attempted rape and facing a grim future, serves as a narrative counterpoint to Insaf's suffering. It exposes the hypocrisy of those who judge and slander women while committing far worse crimes themselves. This subplot reinforces the novel's critique of social and gendered double standards and the dangers of mob mentality. 5. Advances the plot toward justice and redemption. The community's rejection and the boy's fate push Insaf further towards seeking justice and a new life outside the toxic environment of her own diaspora. It sets up the conditions for her eventual rescue by Jennifer Beals and her acceptance into a new, more compassionate community. In summary, this subplot is crucial in showing the depth of Insaf's alienation, the cruelty of social judgment, and the resilience she develops in response. It also serves as a narrative device to deliver poetic justice and to critique the systems, both legal and social, that fail women like Insaf. Ultimately, it propels her towards self-assertion and the possibility of redemption and belonging elsewhere. The community's role in Insaf's isolation is central and multifaceted throughout The Abominable Love. 1. Perpetuation of rumor and slander. The Sudanese community, both in Sudan and in the diaspora, India, is quick to believe and spread rumors about Insaf, often without evidence. In Sudan, neighbors and relatives are the first to accuse her of adultery, pregnancy out of wedlock, and murder, based on gossip and circumstantial evidence. In India, the Sudanese student community amplifies slanderous accusations made by the boy who calls her a prostitute and drug dealer, further damaging her reputation. 2. Social ostracism and exclusion. The community's willingness to believe the worst about Insaf leads to her social exclusion. She is shunned by her own people, denied support, and left vulnerable to abuse and legal peril. Even those who might have been allies are pressured to distance themselves from her, fearing guilt by association or social backlash. 3. Gendered and racial double standards. The community's judgment is deeply gendered. Insaf is harshly condemned for alleged sexual transgressions, while the actual criminal behavior of her male accuser, attempted rape, is initially ignored. Racial prejudice also plays a role, as her relationship with Deng, a Southern African, is seen as a scandal and a betrayal of Arab identity. 4. Mob mentality and public humiliation. The community acts as a mob, publicly humiliating Insaf in court, at social gatherings, and even in the street. She is subjected to verbal abuse, physical attacks, and collective shaming. This mob mentality strips her of dignity and agency, reinforcing her sense of being an outcast. 5. Failure of compassion and solidarity. The community's response to Insaf's suffering is not one of empathy or support, but of condemnation and abandonment. Even when she is most vulnerable, imprisoned, pregnant, or facing deportation, her own people refuse to help, leaving her dependent on outsiders for survival. 6. Narrative consequence. The community's role in isolating Insaf is not just a backdrop, it is an active force that shapes her journey, deepens her trauma, and compels her to seek belonging elsewhere. It also serves as a critique of social systems that prioritize reputation, conformity, and control over justice, compassion, and truth. In summary, the community is both the engine and the enforcer of Insaf's isolation. Through rumor, exclusion, double standards, and mob action, it transforms her from a victim of circumstance into a pariah. This isolation is what ultimately drives her towards self-reliance, new alliances, and the search for a more just and compassionate world. The lady is honored as a goddess of holiness, and how her attempted rapist is punished by neighbors and Indian law. The landlady's honor. The Indian landlady is attacked by a Sudanese student, the same one who previously slandered Insaf, when she comes to collect rent. As he tries to rape her, she screams for help. Neighbors immediately respond. They break down the door, rush in, and physically beat the would-be rapist, leaving him half dead before the police arrive. The Indian police deliberately delay taking him to the hospital, hoping he will die from his injuries, but he is eventually saved by Sudanese colleagues who move him to a better hospital. Community response. The landlady is highly praised by her rescuers and is considered one of the most righteous, honorable, and chaste women of Bombay. She is called the Hindu goddess of devotion and chastity, Sita, referencing the revered wife of the Hindu god Rama from the Ramayana epic, who was kidnapped and later rescued by her husband with the help of the monkey god Hanuman. The narrative explicitly draws this parallel, stating, "The brave Indian woman was highly praised by her rescuers and was considered one of the most righteous, honorable, and chaste women of Bombay. She was called the Hindu goddess of devotion and chastity, Sita, the wife of the Hindu god Rama, who was kidnapped by the evil Ravan and rescued by her husband with the help of the monkey god Hanuman." Punishment of the rapist. The Sudanese student is severely beaten by the neighbors and left half dead. The police eventually take him to a hospital for untouchables, but he is later moved to a better hospital by his Sudanese colleagues. After a month in the hospital, he is transferred to Mumbai Central Jail to stand trial for attempted rape. Legal consequences. If convicted, which is likely, he faces a 20-year sentence in a harsh Bombay prison, where he may die or be killed by Indian gang members. After serving his sentence, he will be deported to Sudan, blacklisted from returning to India, and will return home with a criminal record and no university degree. The narrative presents this as poetic justice for his previous cruelty and false accusations against Insaf. Summary. The landlady is celebrated as a symbol of chastity and righteousness, likened to the goddess Sita, for her courage and virtue in resisting the assault. The rapist is punished both by the immediate community, beaten and shamed, and by the legal system, imprisonment and likely deportation, serving as a narrative example of justice and retribution. The comparison of the Indian landlady to Sita, the goddess of devotion and chastity from the Hindu epic Ramayana, is a powerful symbol in the narrative. Here's an analysis of its symbolism and narrative function. 1. Sita as a symbol of purity and virtue. In Hindu mythology, Sita is revered as the ideal woman, devoted, pure, and steadfast in the face of adversity. She is kidnapped by the demon king Ravana but remains chaste and loyal to her husband, Rama. By likening the landlady to Sita, the narrative elevates her to a status of moral and spiritual purity. She is not just a victim who resists rape, she is a living embodiment of virtue, worthy of reverence and protection. 2. Community recognition and social justice. The neighbor's immediate and forceful intervention to save her, and the subsequent community praise, reflect the idea that society has a duty to protect and honor women who uphold virtue and resist evil. The landlady's transformation into a goddess of holiness is a form of social justice and restoration. She is not shamed or blamed, but celebrated and protected. 3. Contrast with Insaf's experience. The Sita comparison stands in stark contrast to Insaf's own experience, where she is slandered, blamed, and isolated by her community despite being a victim. This juxtaposition highlights the arbitrariness and hypocrisy of social judgment. One woman is deified for her resistance, while another is vilified for circumstances beyond her control. 4. The rapist as the antithesis. The would-be rapist's fate, beaten by the community, imprisoned, and facing a grim future, serves as a narrative foil to the landlady's honor. His punishment is not just legal but also social and symbolic. He is cast as the villain, the demon defeated by the collective action of the community, much like Ravana is defeated by Rama and Hanuman in the epic. 5. Mythic resonance and cultural legitimacy. By invoking the Sita archetype, the narrative taps into a deep well of cultural meaning for Indian readers. It frames the landlady's ordeal and triumph in terms that are immediately recognizable and emotionally resonant. This symbolism also legitimizes her resistance and the community's response, making her a model for other women and a standard for justice. In summary, the Sita comparison is a deliberate narrative device that elevates the landlady's resistance to an act of mythic virtue, provides a model of community-supported justice, highlights the contrast with Insaf's unjust treatment, and reinforces the theme that true honor lies in courage, purity, and solidarity against evil. If you'd like symbol of virtue and chastity, the Indian landlady is depicted as a model of righteousness and courage. When attacked by the Sudanese student, she resists, screams for help, and is immediately rescued by her neighbors. Community support and deification. After the attempted rape, the community rallies around her, beats the perpetrator, and honors her as the Hindu goddess of devotion and chastity, Sita. She is celebrated for her virtue, and her ordeal becomes a story of communal solidarity and justice. Agency and social validation. The landlady's resistance is validated and rewarded by her society. She is not blamed for the attack. Instead, her purity and courage are publicly affirmed. Insaf. Portrayal. Victim of slander and isolation. Insaf, in contrast, is repeatedly slandered, accused of prostitution and drug dealing, and ostracized by her own Sudanese community, both in Sudan and in India. Lack of community support. When Insaf is attacked, verbally, legally, or physically, she is not defended by her community. Instead, she is blamed, shamed, and left to fend for herself. Even when she acts in self-defense, throwing her shoe at her slanderer, she is further isolated. Endurance and self-reliance. Insaf's agency is forged in adversity. She must rely on her own resilience and, eventually, the compassion of outsiders, like the Indian Christian family and Jennifer Beals, rather than her own people. Key contrasts. Aspect landlady Insaf. Community response, immediate rescue, honor and celebration, slander, isolation, and abandonment. Symbolism Sita, goddess of chastity and devotion, scapegoat, outcast, wrongly accused. Agency, her resistance is validated and rewarded. Her resistance leads to further isolation. Outcome, elevated as a model of virtue, forced into exile, must seek new belonging. Justice, rapist is punished. She is vindicated. Slanderers often go unpunished. She suffers. Narrative significance. The landlady's story is a rare example of communal justice and the celebration of female virtue. Her ordeal is transformed into a mythic narrative, and she is protected and honored by her society. Insaf's story is a critique of social hypocrisy and the failure of community. She is punished for circumstances beyond her control, and her suffering exposes the dangers of rumor, misogyny, and the lack of compassion in her own community. The contrast highlights the arbitrariness of social judgment. One woman is deified for her resistance, while another is vilified and abandoned for her victimhood. In summary, the landlady is portrayed as a communal heroine, her virtue affirmed and protected. Insaf, by contrast, is a tragic figure whose suffering is compounded by her community's betrayal, forcing her to seek dignity and justice outside her own society. If you'd like, I can provide direct quotes or further explore the implications of this contrast for the novel's themes. Chapter A. Ahmed, the landlady's love affair with another Sudanese boy, despite having a husband in Saudi Arabia, is not condemned in the same way as Insaf's relationships. Here's how and why this difference is portrayed. Landlady's affair, community response. The landlady is described as having a secret love affair with a Sudanese student while her husband is away working in Saudi Arabia. When the Sudanese student attempts to rape her, she resists, screams, and is rescued by neighbors. After the incident, the community does not focus on her extramarital relationship. Instead, they praise her for her resistance and honor her as a goddess of devotion and chastity. Sita. She is celebrated for her virtue and courage, and her ordeal is transformed into a story of communal solidarity and justice. Reasons for lack of condemnation. Victimhood and agency. The landlady is positioned as a victim of attempted rape, not as a willing participant in an affair. Her resistance and the violence against her overshadow any moral scrutiny of her personal life. Her agency in defending herself is seen as heroic, and the community rallies to her side. Community's need for a heroine. The narrative and the community need a figure to honor and rally around. The landlady's ordeal provides an opportunity for collective action and affirmation of communal values. By likening her to Sita, the community elevates her above reproach, focusing on her chastity and courage rather than her private life. Contrast with Insaf's treatment. Insaf, by contrast, is slandered, isolated, and condemned for alleged sexual transgressions, even when she is a victim. The difference highlights the arbitrariness and hypocrisy of social judgment. The landlady's virtue is constructed by her resistance and the community's need for a heroine, while Insaf's victimhood is ignored and she is scapegoated. Narrative function. The landlady's story serves as a foil to Insaf's. It shows how community support and narrative framing can transform a woman's experience from shame to honor, while lack of support can turn a victim into a pariah. Summary table. Character affair/relationship community response outcome. Landlady affair with student honored as Sita, not condemned, celebrated, protected. Insaf love/marriage, often forced or victimized, slandered, isolated, condemned, ostracized, exiled. Narrative significance. The landlady's lack of condemnation, despite her affair, exposes the selective morality and double standards of the community. It underscores the novel's critique of how women's reputations are constructed or destroyed not by their actions alone, but by how their stories are told and who chooses to support or abandon them. The contrast between the landlady's portrayal and Insaf's in The Abominable Love serves a critical narrative role that deepens the novel's exploration of justice, gender, and social hypocrisy. 1. Exposes double standards and social hypocrisy. The landlady, despite having a secret affair while her husband is abroad, is celebrated as a goddess of chastity after resisting an attempted rape. The community rallies to her defense, honors her, and erases any hint of scandal. Insaf, by contrast, is relentlessly slandered, blamed, and isolated for alleged sexual transgressions, many of which are fabricated or the result of her victimization. She receives no communal support, even when she is a victim. Narrative role. This contrast exposes the arbitrariness and hypocrisy of social judgment, showing how reputation and honor are not based on truth or justice, but on communal needs, narrative framing, and who is chosen as a symbol. 2. Highlights the power of community framing. The landlady's ordeal is transformed into a mythic narrative of virtue because the community needs a heroine and a story of collective triumph. Insaf's suffering is used as a cautionary tale and a scapegoat for communal anxieties about gender, race, and sexuality. Narrative role. The novel critiques how communities construct heroes and villains, often regardless of the facts, and how women's fates are determined by these shifting narratives. 3. Reinforces themes of justice and injustice. The landlady's story is one of communal justice. The rapist is punished, and she is vindicated. Insaf's story is one of systemic injustice. She is punished by the community, the law, and even her own family, despite her innocence or victimhood. Narrative role. This contrast dramatizes the novel's central theme, that justice is not equally available to all, and that the marginalized are often doubly victimized, first by their circumstances, then by society's response. 4. Deepens Insaf's tragedy and isolation. By showing what communal support and vindication look like in the landlady's case, the novel makes Insaf's isolation and suffering even more poignant. The reader is invited to question why Insaf is denied the same compassion and protection, and to empathize with her plight. Narrative role. The contrast amplifies the emotional impact of Insaf's journey and underscores the need for a more just and compassionate society. 5. Symbolic commentary on gender and power. The landlady's elevation to Sita status is symbolic of how women can be deified or demonized based on communal needs, not personal reality. Insaf's scapegoating is symbolic of how women who do not fit the community's narrative, whether by choice or by circumstance, are cast out. Narrative role. The novel uses these contrasting portrayals to comment on the precariousness of women's social standing and the dangers of collective moral judgment. In summary, Between the Landlady and Insaf is not just a plot device, it is a deliberate narrative strategy that exposes the mechanisms of social control, the fragility of justice, and the human cost of communal hypocrisy. It invites the reader to reflect on who gets to be honored, who is condemned, and why. If you'd like, I can provide direct passages from the novel to illustrate this contrast, or further discuss its implications for the story's themes.